There is so much misinformation out there about vegan diets. Are they healthy? Are they not? Are you missing the adequate amount of nutrients? Are you getting everything that you need? And even, are you more likely to break your bones if you're vegan? Well, we're going to talk about the top 5 vegan myths as we head into 2020. And we're going to do that with a gentleman who I just had the pleasure of meeting up in Vancouver when I was speaking in Canada. He is a naturopathic doctor, and now I consider him to be a close personal friend. Dr. Matthew Navarra, thank you so very much for being here, my friend.
Thanks for having me on, and thanks for the intro.
How often do you have conversations with patients or even people that you just meet on the street and they're asking you about a plant-based diet? Is it or is it not healthy? And then you just have to clear up all kinds of confusion.
You're missing one group, and that's the Instagram space. That's where I get most of the questions. It's not always on the street. It's not always in my office, although it does happen there a lot too. But definitely online. I don't even know how many questions per day.
Yeah, they just seem to be so pervasive, and it's not one of those, I would say, like just kind of easy-going debates. It's like people are passionate about their food, and they are passionate about their diets, and I obviously am too. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation. The exam room wouldn't exist, and I'm assuming you're pretty passionate about getting the healthy message of a plant-based diet out there as well.
Yeah, 100%. All my days off are spent doing that, so really, really passionate about it.
What days off, man? If you're doing that, that's work, man. You're getting it done. But let's go ahead and dive into those 5 myths. We've come up with 5 of the biggest for the purpose of this conversation today, even though I'm sure there are 25, even 50 of them that we could tackle. But let's go ahead and start with that big one, and that is that if you're eating a plant-based diet, a vegan diet, there is no way in the world you're getting all the nutrients that you need.
Yeah, that one always gets me because it's so funny. When we look at the research on different populations, we can look in Brazil, Switzerland, Finland, across the U.S. and Canada. When we actually compare nutrient intakes between vegans, vegetarians, meat eaters, we actually see that the vegans do as well, or in a lot of cases even better than the meat eaters do for overall nutrition. That's not to say that there aren't certain nutrients of focus. Yes, vegans should be taking a B12 supplement. Yes, here in Vancouver anyway, you should be taking a vitamin D supplement, and there may be a couple others to consider. But overall, we actually see that as far as nutrient intake goes, it's pretty good amongst the vegans. And it's a shame that we always think that you're eating McDonald's every day and nobody really seems to bat an eye about deficiency, when really we should maybe be worried about excess there. But when you start ditching the animal products and going more towards the plant-based side, the classic meme, everyone becomes a nutrition expert, right? They start asking me all the questions and, where are you going to get X, Y, Z? But overall, you're eating a variety of whole plant foods or minimally processed plant foods, and you're probably doing pretty well.
Yeah, you know what, and I think that's really a good point that you make there, because what never comes up in these conversations, just as you said, somebody goes to McDonald's, they don't bat an eyelash, but I would think that the prevalence of some sort of nutrient deficiency is rather high no matter what diet a person is eating.
Yeah, and the other thing that comes up a lot is you'll hear a lot of these people say, oh, you need to be really focused to eat a vegan diet. You need to be super educated on where to get all of your different nutrients. But again, when we look at the research on these different populations, we aren't looking at some nutrition experts. We're looking at the general population, those people who have decided to ditch the animal products for plant foods for whatever reason. We don't know. It's not necessarily health reasons. It could have been ethical reasons. It could have been environmental reasons. And still, we see they're doing pretty well. And yeah, I mean, iron, which is something we're going to talk about more, is the #1 nutrient deficiency in the world. It's certainly not a vegan-specific problem. B12, especially in older populations, becomes a problem as well because you absorb less of it as you age. Vitamin D, again, living here in Vancouver, it's probably a problem for a lot more than just the vegans. So there are concerns amongst all populations, and no matter what diet you're eating, you want to ensure that you're getting your nutrition. It's not just the vegans, which is kind of the point that really annoys me about that question, because it always seems to be directed at that specific population.
And as you were talking, I was looking up nutrient deficiency prevalence, and according to this study that was published a few years ago, 31% of the entire U.S. population is at risk of having at least one vitamin deficiency. And so then you talk about the various diets, and no, 31% of the U.S. population is not eating a plant-based diet. Nowhere close to that, ergo, a lot of people have a lot of room for improvement. And then if you go and you look at the global prevalence, you scroll down here and you see this other study. It says in some areas of the world, you're looking at up to 60 or 70% of the population having some sort of deficiency. So I think that that's really a key fact that often gets overlooked in this conversation. So I'm glad that you and I are able to bring that up today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and especially when we look at global prevalence too. I mean, there are other issues there. There's food security issues. There's these other factors that we have to consider too. It's not just about whether or not you're eating animal products.
No question about that. No question about that. Let's go on to another one. We'll go to myth number 2 here. This is an interesting one that I really didn't even think about until started to do these shows and speaking with experts such as yourself, and that is the belief that if you're eating a plant-based diet, and especially if you take dairy out of your diet, you're more at risk to break your bones.
Yeah, this really popped off like 2 years ago now, 2019, when the Epic Oxford study came out, suggesting that vegans were at higher risk of fracture. And all of the Joe Rogans of the world, all the big names we're talking about, or the big names in the kind of like anti-vegan or vegan combaters really started to run with it. And we have to look at the nuances in this study. There are a couple of issues. For one, the Epic Oxford population, which is a UK-based population they were looking at, the vegans in that group tended to not always be the most health-focused. There weren't super high rates of like B12 supplementation. If we look at data during the winter time anyways, the vegans dipped into deficiency for vitamin D. And when you look at a breakdown of men, premenopausal women, postmenopausal women, it was actually only the postmenopausal women that were at increased risk of fracture compared to the median. The vegan men weren't at risk compared to the non-vegan men, and the premenopausal women also were not. Another really big factor was that the vegans tended to weigh a lot less. Now, one of the biggest factors for fracture risk is weight. If you're light, especially underweight, your risk of fracture goes way, way, way up because you're not stressing your bones all the time. Your bones don't have a chance to really strengthen. And we had a lot of vegans under a BMI of about 20, which is just on the bottom end of what would be considered a normal BMI or healthy BMI. Now, if we make the cutoff 22.5 for your BMI, so you only look at people who are around the middle of the normal range to the higher end of the normal range and above, vegans did not have a higher risk of fracture. So that tells us that BMI was actually, or the low BMI in the vegans was actually a driving force behind that. Now, that can be a good thing in certain ways, but not so good if you're underweight. And we can suspect, based on the number of vegans that were below that lower BMI cutoff, that we had a fair amount of them that were actually underweight and possibly significantly underweight. Now that's one big factor. Now, of course, calcium is something to discuss, protein intake, and these researchers, when they only looked at individuals with, at least I would say, a decent calcium intake, there was still a risk of fracture. It was less than if we didn't only look at those who were consuming more calcium, but there was still an increase in risk. Same with when you consider protein. Yes, higher protein intake decreased risk a little bit, but there was still residual risk there, and I would suspect, based on everything I've just said, that it was the low BMI that was the main factor there. But we also have a study that came out just earlier this year from the Adventist cohort, the Adventist Health Study 2. And this one looked at vegans, vegetarians, we'll call them flexitarians, semi-vegetarians, what they named them, and meat eaters. And again, vegans had a higher risk, but it was only, again, the vegan peri-postmenopausal women. And when they supplemented both calcium and vitamin D, there was no increase in risk anymore. So the risk was only there for hip fracture and I believe total fracture for those who were not supplementing calcium or vitamin D, which does suggest to me that yes, we want to really make sure we're getting our good calcium sources, things like fortified plant milks, tofu, certain other foods like tahini, even broccoli can be decent sources, and so on. And we definitely want to make sure you're taking your vitamin D if you live in northern latitudes.
All right, so a couple of points to unpack there.
Yeah.
Number one, you're talking about being underweight while eating a plant-based or vegan diet. It is possible also, even if you're not eating a plant-based diet, for a person to be underweight, correct?
Yeah, and there's actually some speculation I've seen from other professionals that we have to consider the possibility of people adopting plant-based or vegan diets, if you want to call it that, with eating disorder, right? Like, it's not necessarily that the diet could have caused that, but someone could shift towards that plant-based diet as a way to restrict their intake if they do have pre-existing eating disorders as well.
And another conversation that I had with someone in the plant-based space, very well-known name, was a rather interesting one, and it also goes to weight and to BMI and how that factors into fracture risk. But instead of talking about bone density and strengthening the bones because of the excess weight, they were like, well, you also have to remember that without the fat around your body, you don't have that padding. They said it's kind of like bubble wrap with a package, right? It kind of protects you if you were to fall. And I laughed at that initially, but then I was like, that's so common sense. There's probably something to it as well.
Yeah, no, I would not be surprised at all. And for those of us who or for I guess any vegan who might be a bit on the lighter side as well, which could be a good thing for risk of certain diseases. Weight-bearing exercise, that's the way to do it. Lift weights, run, walk if that's what you feel comfortable doing. Something where you're carrying either your own body's weight or added weight can help add that pressure to your bones to help strengthen them over time.
All right, next up is protein. I mean, you're talking about vegan myths, Doc. You obviously can't go this conversation without talking about protein. And it's not just about where you get your protein, because let's just assume at this point that we're talking to someone who does realize that there is protein found in plants. But then the conversation can kind of shift to the quality of protein and whether it can match up from animal sources versus plant sources. So when it comes to the quality of protein a person is consuming, how does a plant-based diet compare to the standard Western diet?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because this is what my presentation at the Planted Expo was all about, where I met you. So there are a few factors to say the quality of protein. For one, we want to look at the amino acid content. One of the claims towards vegan diets or plant-based foods anyway, is that they have a poor amino acid profile. And amino acids, for those of you who are not aware, are the building blocks of protein. You can think of them as the little Lego blocks that you stick together and you build a full structure, a protein out of it. Well, plant foods tend to have lower amounts of maybe one or two of the 9 essential amino acids, meaning the 9 amino acids that we need to eat in our diet. And so, if you ate just that food and ate nothing else and just barely met your minimum protein requirement, you might actually not have gotten enough protein because you'd be lacking in that one amino acid or maybe 2 amino acids. Fortunately, we don't do that. We eat multiple foods. We eat a variety. You eat your beans, you eat your grains, you eat your nuts, seeds, veggies, fruits. And so, all in all, over the course of a whole day, you shouldn't have to worry about it. It shouldn't be a concern at all if you're eating a variety of protein and eating enough overall protein. So that would be one. Actually, the one food that's food product that's completely missing one of the essential amino acids is collagen or gelatin, which is an animal product. So I like to throw that one in there. Now, with digestibility being the other concern, so some proponents of animal protein will say that plant protein isn't as digestible. You don't absorb as much of it when you eat it. They will base that on 2 scales. One is called the PDCAAS, Protein Digestibility Corrected Amino Acid Score, but I'll call it PDCAAS. and the other one is the digestible indispensable amino acids, or I'll call it the DS for short. Now the PDCAS basically measures the amount of protein digested by feeding foods, usually to rodents, and then measuring how much protein goes in and how much comes out the other end. Now the difference is supposedly what was absorbed. But there are a few issues with that. For one, we aren't rodents. We have different protein requirements. We utilize them differently. Two, they're looking at the entire digestive tract, and some of the bacteria near the end of the digestive tract might chew up some of the protein too, so a little bit of a kind of inaccurate reading. And three, this is the biggest one, it also docks points if your protein isn't complete, or if it is lacking or lower in one or two amino acids, which, as I just mentioned, will kind of sway the results towards favoring animal protein over plant protein, even though it may not matter in the context of a overall diet. Now, the DS aims to correct for some of those issues. For one, they use pigs, which are closer to humans in digestive tract, but still not anywhere near, or not necessarily the same. Now, they also tend to feed raw foods. That's a problem. So they feed raw legumes, raw grains even, and when you cook those foods, you increase your digestibility. So they're using products that might actually, again, dock points on the plant side.
Let's try it with the 10s.
Again, they look at the limiting amino acid. So they're looking at the amino acid that, or the amino acids, I should say, that might be a little bit lower in that given food, and docking points for that, same way that they did with the PDCAS, which is, again, irrelevant in the context of a overall diet. And they actually measure digestion specifically from mouth to the end of the small intestine. So they actually insert a tube to the abdomen. Not very nice. Obviously, I wish they didn't do that. But they remove the food at the end of the small intestine, so that removes some of that bacterial digestion I was talking about. But a lot of issues there. What we need to look at is actual human data. And the limited amount of human data that we have, looking at digestion again from mouth to end of small intestine, usually through ileostomy bags, we see that there is maybe a few percent difference at most. It's absolutely tiny difference between the digestibility of either animal or plant protein sources. But what really matters is, does it lead to similar muscle growth or strength gains? Who cares about the amino acid profile differences or digestibility differences and all of that if the result is the same, right? That's what we should care about. And we do have research on that. We have a lot of research comparing whey protein, pea protein, even some on rice protein to whey protein, which is considered the highest quality of a lot of the animal protein. And we consistently see if you're having the same amount of protein and a high quality protein at that, there's very little, or actually there's no measurable difference between the different sources. So the plant sources perform just as well as the animal source. And some might see that and say, well, those are supplements. They're isolated. They're more digestible. How can we say that that's relevant to overall foods if you're having a vegan diet versus an omnivorous diet? Well, a study published early this year, early 2021, actually hopefully puts that to rest. They took 19 vegans and 19 meat eaters. These are all men. They had them up their protein intake, either from plant sources by supplementing a soy protein on top of their diet, or in the animal group or omnivore group, whey protein, so that they were having 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. That's kind of where you don't see further benefit for strength gains. And after 12 weeks of training, resistance training, no difference, statistically significant difference between the different groups. So that should tell us that in a diet where most of your protein intake is coming from either exclusively plant foods or a mix of plant and animal foods with, yes, a bit of supplementation there. If there's no difference there, I don't suspect we will see a difference, and I don't suspect we should think that there's a difference.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up that study, because there is a large percentage of our audience who's like, they just can't get on board whatsoever with animal testing, and that's something that we work very hard with at the Nutrition Committee as well to end that. and find those human relevant methods. And it sounds to me like the quality of data you were talking about, where they pitted vegans and non-vegans head to head there, that data is cool. And I think that if you expand that study, get some more participants, repeat it a few times, I think that, then you've got yourself a home run, and you wouldn't need to worry about the rodent experiments or the pig experiments, which oftentimes, Doc, those results don't even translate into human results. So
yeah, that's sorry, I was just going to mention that too. Like that's the thing with a lot of the animal research, is it often doesn't translate anyway. And when we have human data, especially for something like muscle and strength gains, as I just mentioned, then why do we need it? We shouldn't, especially for something like that.
Now, let me ask you, there is the assumption here that we're talking about a whole food plant-based diet, so the upper echelon, the upper tier of a healthy diet there. But what if somebody is eating a lot of these processed vegan foods that you would find in the frozen food section or in the middle of the store? They're prepackaged, basically ready to roll. Would there be a risk of protein deficiency if you're eating that type of food?
No, not at all. If anything, actually, especially mock meat products, like the plant-based meat alternatives, would be excellent sources of protein. They are typically made with actually protein isolates, so they'd be really high in protein. And from a health standpoint, sure, maybe we can say that your black bean burger is going to be healthier than a Beyond Burger. I don't think many people are going to argue with that. But we do have research comparing Beyond Burgers to even organic meat products. There was a study called the Swap Meat Study that it was a randomized crossover trial where they had participants have either 2 or more servings of Beyond Meat products per day, or 2 or more servings of organic meat products, and not even your regular meat, which is, I think, a good part on the researchers there for going for the organic, just to really show that there isn't much of a difference. I can't recall exactly how long the trial was. I think it was 8 weeks. We saw that the Beyond group actually lowered or dropped a little bit of weight, and then they lowered their LDL cholesterol compared to the organic meat group, suggesting a lower risk of cardiovascular disease as well. So the data, although limited, that we do have on these mock meat products, even some of the higher saturated fat ones, like a Beyond Meat product, actually suggest benefit if you are swapping from the animal products from meat over to those. It always depends on what you're comparing to, though. That's the most important question in nutrition, is compared to what.
And my final point on this is, look, if there are vegan bodybuilders who are like 3 times as big, Doc, as you and I put together, all muscles, then that tells you everything that you need to know. Those people do exist, and they are enormous, and they are super strong, and they eat carbs, by the way. So let's move on and put the focus for number 4 here on our vegan myth list on a specific nutrient, and this is an interesting one, iron. You hear about this sometimes with a plant-based diet. Maybe there's the belief that if you're eating exclusively plants, you're not going to be able to get enough iron, because where does iron come from? Well, it comes from meat, it comes from liver, it comes from animal products. But when somebody tells you that, what would your rebuttal be?
So if we look at developed countries, we actually don't typically see a difference in iron deficiency rates amongst, say, vegans, vegetarians, or meat eaters. They tend to be really similar, and there's a few reasons for that. So, for one, if you eat plant-based iron or non-heme iron with vitamin C, with bell peppers, broccoli, citrus fruits, you can actually really increase the absorption of that iron. Also, if your iron stores are low, you boost your absorption of non-heme iron or plant iron. If your stores are topped up where they should be, then you decrease absorption, so you really regulate that. So if you're on the low end, and you add vitamin C to the mix, you can boost your absorption to roughly around what you get with heme iron from animal products anyway. The nice thing is, it prevents you, in a lot of cases, from getting too high with your iron intake, which can also be, or your iron status, I should say, which can also be a negative and increase your risk of certain diseases. Now, heme iron that you get from animal products, sure, it's very consistently absorbed. They have a pretty narrow range of the percentage that's absorbed. But it's also associated with an increased risk of several diseases, such as type 2 diabetes, certain cancers, even cardiovascular disease. So it's not something we want to be getting too much of in our diet, or in a lot of cases, like we do, we can have zero and just focus on the plant sources. Of course, if you are deficient in iron, especially if you're anemic, then yeah, supplementation could be a great strategy for boosting values as well. There's nothing wrong with that. Like I said, iron is the #1 nutrient deficiency in the world, and I think a lot of people could benefit from that, but it's not something that we need to necessarily worry about unless it is a problem, which you can find out with blood testing, how you're feeling, are you fatigued, and so on. But I would not think at all that it is a vegan-specific problem. But if you look at data in, say, developing nations, you will sometimes see that those eating like vegetarian diets might be at higher risk than those eating omnivorous diets, but that largely has to do with overall diet quality, not just because you're plant-based per se.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but eating vitamin C with the non-heme iron, that improves absorption, doesn't it?
Yeah, I just mentioned that. Like,
yeah.
like bell peppers, citrus fruits, broccoli, all really good for trying to boost absorption, or some people even take a vitamin C supplement to boost that.
There you go. That's important. I just wanted to follow up on that. Because that one just, it gets him. And by the way, that's so easy to do. Like, if you have a bunch of greens and you're doing the salad thing, just take, either like a lemon and squeeze that over the top, or you can take an orange and squeeze that over the top, and boom, there you go. There's your vitamin C if you're not a fan of peppers. It's really easy to do. In your practice, how frequently do you encounter patients who have iron deficiency?
That's the funny thing. So I get a lot of people coming in, especially women of menstruating age where it's the highest risk. And they'll tell me they're iron deficient, and then I'll look at their labs and they aren't. So I think some standards, not necessarily by the medical community, but some standards for iron levels that you'll see, especially in the online blogosphere, as we call it, they're ridiculous. They'll be telling women you need to have 100 micrograms per liter for your ferritin or you're deficient, which is just absurd. By that standard, almost 100% of menstruating women are going to be deficient. You need to have realistic standards, and you need to look at blood counts, see are they anemic, is their hemoglobin okay. You need to look at the full picture as well as the symptoms. So I see a lot of people who think they're iron deficient, and a handful of them truly are, but I don't think it's as common amongst that group as they tend to think.
And isn't supplementing with that high of a level of iron, doesn't that present its own risks? I believe that's been tied to cognitive decline in older people.
Well, yeah, so elevated ferritin levels, even though that's technically in the normal range, but once you get up to those levels, 100 and above, your risk of certain diseases does go up. Now, I haven't looked so much at the cognitive side, but definitely for things like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and so on, we do see a higher risk there. So, it could even be considered dangerous advice to tell people to supplement, especially high doses once they're already way up there with their values.
All right, and last but not least, because it just keeps coming up in every single myth show that we do, and people want exclusive shows on this very topic, we can't do a myth list, Doc, without also talking about soy. You mentioned it when we were talking about protein and how it does contain a lot there, but soy is thought of as the devil in a lot of circles. It's like one of the least healthy things you can eat in the entire world. You'd be better off eating a triple whopper. But what is the truth about soy?
Yeah, so soy gets a bad rap because it contains isoflavones. These are compounds. They're also known as phytoestrogens, and I think that's the word that gets people, right? Phytoestrogen, thinking it's estrogen, going to act like estrogen. And these phytoestrogens are about 1/1000th the strength of our own body's estrogens, but they mimic estrogen in structure in certain ways, so they can bind to some of the same receptors. Now, with that, some people think, it's going to promote my breast cancer, it's going to promote breast cancer because it's going to bind to the receptors in the breast tissue and wreak havoc. But that's not really how it works. These, as I mentioned, phytoestrogens are very weak compared to our own estrogens, and they also bind to specific receptors. They actually select for specific receptors that can have different impacts in different parts of the body. So in breast tissue, for example, these beta receptors, they can actually have anti-estrogenic effects. So it can actually do the opposite of estrogen in the breast tissue.
That's right.
In bone tissue, it actually promotes an estrogenic response. which is a good thing as well for bone mineral density in postmenopausal women especially, and there is some research on soy consumption and fracture risk, seeing that it does reduce fracture risk. So from a purely estrogenic standpoint, the kind of physiology of what's happening is completely misunderstood. Now we also have, some rodent studies, which again doesn't translate to humans, showing that the concentrations of phytoestrogens in their blood can ramp up by just absurd amounts when they consume these phytoestrogens. But when humans do it, the blood levels or tissue levels don't increase very much. So again, very different responses between animals and humans. And most importantly, we have many randomized controlled trials. In fact, we have meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials on soy and soy phytoestrogen consumption and its effect on either estrogen or testosterone levels in both men and women, and we don't see that it alters value. So that should be the end of the story as far as the estrogen response goes, or the feminizing effects in men that is commonly claimed.
Let me jump in, because to that end, one of the favorite points that was ever brought up on this show was by Dr. Neil Barnard when we were talking about soy, and I asked him about the feminization of men if they eat soy. He's like, man, if you go to the beach and you talk to a gentleman who is perhaps a little bit overweight and has developed breast tissue, he's like, I guarantee you that he will have eaten, say, a triple whopper that day, but he has never had an ounce of soy in his entire life. So, like, when you put it in those terms, it makes a whole lot of sense, and you don't need a whole heck of a lot of really scientific terms to hammer this point home.
Yeah, and actually the one that I always jump to, because sure, if we're to go on stereotypes, soy is seen as feminizing, and then like beer is seen as the manly drink, right? A lot of the time.